On one side of your screen, a small, unassuming office in modern London, glass and steel reflecting a world of digital transactions and shareholder meetings. On the other, a vast, vibrant subcontinent, teeming with life, ruled by ancient dynasties. What if I told you that the modern office and the historic empire are connected by a single terrifying idea? What if I told you the world's most powerful empire was, for a time, not run by a king or a government, but by a company with its own army, its own laws, and an insatiable appetite for profit? This is the story of the British East India Company. It wasn't just a business, it was a new kind of power, a legal predator that pioneered corporate colonialism and wrote the blueprint for how a handful of men in a boardroom could come to rule a nation. The central question is not just what they did, but how they got away with it. How did a group of merchants conquer a subcontinent? Our story begins in the late 16th century, a time when Europe was gripped by a fever. The fever for spice. Nutmeg, cloves, pepper. These weren't just flavorings, they were wealth itself, worth more than their weight in gold. But the journey to the East Indies was treacherous, a deadly gamble against storms, pirates, and disease. On the last day of the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I of England signed a document. It was a royal charter granted to a group of 218 merchants calling themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. It gave them a 15-year monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. This document, this piece of paper, was the company's birth certificate. More importantly, it was its first legal weapon. In its early days, the East India Company, or EIC, was a fragile entity. It faced brutal competition from the established Portuguese and, most fiercely, the Dutch, whose own corporate titan, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or VOC, dominated the spice trade. The EIC was just one player in a dangerous game, but it had ambition and it had the backing of the English crown. It was learning. The genius of the East India Company was not just in what it traded, but in how it manipulated the law to its advantage. Its power grew not by breaking the rules, but by rewriting them. Its primary tool was the royal charter itself. Over the decades, this charter was renewed and expanded. Each renewal granted the company more power. Soon, it could not only trade, but could acquire territory, mint currency, command fortresses and troops, form alliances, make war and peace, and exercise both civil and criminal jurisdiction. Think about that. A private corporation was given the rights of a sovereign state. With these rights, the company built its second tool, a private army. What began as a few hundred guards to protect warehouses grew into one of the most formidable military forces on the planet. By the early 19th century, the EIC's private army numbered over 260,000 men, twice the size of the official British Army. This wasn't a security force. It was an army of conquest funded by corporate revenue. Armed with state-like powers and a massive army, the company perfected its third tactic, the unequal treaty and the puppet ruler. In India, the Mughal Empire was weakening, and hundreds of local princes and nawabs vied for power. The EIC exploited these rivalries with surgical precision. It would offer military support to one prince in exchange for trade concessions. Once that prince was in power, he owed them. He became a puppet, dependent on the company's bayonets to keep his throne. The company ruled through him, maintaining a facade of local authority while holding the real power. The final step in this legal plunder was the masterstroke. After the decisive Battle of Plassey in 1757, where a small company force defeated the much larger army of the Nawab of Bengal, the Mughal emperor was forced to grant the EIC the Diwani of Bengal. The Diwani was the right to collect taxes on behalf of the emperor. This was the ultimate prize. The EIC was now the de facto government of India's richest province. It collected taxes from 20 million people and used that money to fund its army and buy Indian goods to export to London. They had created the perfect circular economy of exploitation. They used India's own money to buy India's resources, ship them home, and record it all as profit. It was state-sanctioned looting on an unimaginable scale. With the Diwani, the mask came off. The company's mission shifted from trade to pure extraction. Using their private army and puppet rulers, they expanded their control across the subcontinent, state by state, treaty by treaty, battle by battle. The economic consequences were catastrophic for India. For centuries, India had been a global center of textile manufacturing. Its fine cottons and silks were desired across the world. The company systematically dismantled this industry. It imposed crushing taxes on local weavers and flooded the market with cheap British-made cloth. Millions of artisans were driven into poverty. India was transformed from a manufacturing powerhouse into a captive market for British goods. The agricultural policies were even more devastating. The company demanded taxes in cash, forcing farmers to grow cash crops like opium and indigo instead of food. When drought struck Bengal in 1770, the result was one of the worst famines in human history. With no food reserves, an estimated 10 million people, a third of the population of Bengal, starved to death. Throughout this, the company's tax collection barely faltered. Its officials, known as Nawabs, amassed staggering personal fortunes, buying their way into British high society with wealth bled from a dying land. The brutality and corruption eventually reached a breaking point. In 1857, Indian soldiers in the company's army, called sepoys, rebelled. The Great Indian Mutiny was a brutal, year-long war that shook the foundations of company rule. It was a desperate, violent cry against a century of exploitation. The rebellion was crushed, but it exposed the horrific reality of corporate rule to the world. The British government could no longer ignore the monster it had created. In 1858, the Crown stepped in, dissolved the East India Company, and assumed direct control of India. The age of the Company Raj was over. The age of the British Raj had begun. But the end of the East India Company was not the end of its business model. The idea that a corporation could act like a state, bending laws and nations to its will, was a genie that could not be put back in the bottle. This was not an isolated case. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, had perfected its own brand of corporate savagery a century earlier. To secure a total monopoly on nut rag and mace, the VOC systematically slaughtered, enslaved, or deported nearly the entire population of the Banda Islands in present-day Indonesia. They demonstrated that for a corporation seeking absolute market control, no human cost was too high. The EIC simply scaled up this ruthless model of corporate colonialism. This legacy echoes today. Look closely, and you will see the ghost of the company everywhere. When multinational corporations use complex international trade agreements to sue governments for passing environmental laws that might hurt their profits, that is the ghost of the Royal Charter. When private military contractors operate in war zones with little public oversight, that is the ghost of the company's private army. When tech giants create digital ecosystems so vast they effectively write their own rules for speech, commerce, and privacy, that is the ghost of the company state. They exploit resources in developing nations, lobby governments to create favorable tax loopholes, and operate on a scale that dwarfs the economies of many countries they operate in. The tactics are more subtle now. They use lawyers and lobbyists instead of cannons and sepoys, but the fundamental principle remains the same. The pursuit of profit can become a power that rivals the state. Have we truly escaped the East India Company's model, or have the legal predators of our time simply learned to hunt more quietly? The story of the East India Company is a journey from a handful of investors in a London boardroom to the absolute rulers of 250 million people. It is the ultimate cautionary tale of unchecked corporate power. It shows us that the line between a business and an empire, between profit and plunder, is terrifyingly thin. The company's greatest weapon was not its army, but its ability to frame conquest as commerce and exploitation as law. It mastered the art of making tyranny look like a business transaction. History has shown us what happens when the interests of shareholders are placed above the interests of humanity. It is up to us now to recognize these patterns in our own world. The names have changed, but the game remains the same.